Hey guys, Ermin here from Systematic Productions. What we'll be going over today is how to take your flat bass DI from sounding like this to sounding like this using the new Neural DSP Darkglass Ultra plugins. And in a global mix context, we'll be sounding like this. Alright, so to get to it, what we'll do is strip all the bass processing that I've done to get to that point. Beautiful. And we'll go to our Darkglass Ultra track here. Now note what I'm doing going into this plugin is running a preset EQ curve. Now the reason I'm doing this is to essentially emulate what you would do with a bass preamp recording direct in. So instead of the recording being completely flat, so it's obviously a very good sounding bass, but it's a flat signal. This is sort of how they come out, very mid-heavy, lacking in sheen and sparkle. So we give it a little bit of that going into the plugin. Again, nothing drastic, just give it a little bit more aggression and zing going in. Alright, so the next step is turning on the Darkglass plugin. So when this plugin starts, everything's up at noon and the quality defaults to low. You want to immediately set that to high, assuming you have the CPU power. And from there on out, just take a listen to what it sounds like with your particular bass. Alright, so pretty cool, but once again, sort of flat and uninspiring. So let us tweak some settings and see what we come up with. Perhaps the first thing you want to tweak is the blend knob. The blend essentially controls how much flat DI you get compared to how much process signal. Generally, in my experiences, I find that anywhere from about 3 o'clock to maximum is the way to go, depending on how aggressive you want to get with the tone. Now I don't want to get too insane with the drive on this. Obviously you've got the flexibility to go as high as you could conceivably need to, but we'll keep it around about 1-2 o'clock here. And one other thing that I do is that I'll drive the level up. Now bear in mind, this is very strongly affected by the grunt setting. The grunt setting essentially determines how much of each frequency band is being driven into that distortion circuit. The mid position favors the top end, the upper position favors the bottom end, and the bottom position is just a flat line. Because I'm after something clean for this particular sound, I'll be keeping it in the middle. The default settings, once again, sound absolutely fine. Now, from here on out, because this bass is fairly well balanced going into the plugin, I don't need to tweak the EQ settings very much. This is one of those plugins where things kind of sound pretty good even at noon. But one thing we might want to do is just crank up the upper mid and the treble. Round about there. Now the cool thing about the default high mid setup is that it's centered around about 3K, which is pretty much a perfect upper mid frequency to boost on bass. You find yourself needing to do that in most mixes, depending on the bass anyway, so I generally don't find a need to deviate from that default setting. In the lower mid-range, however, the center points are really handy, so I normally set it to the 500 Hz setting here. I find it can give you a really nice scoop if you so need. 500 Hz is usually a range that you would want to dip on a flat bass DI anyway, but because we're doing some of that conversely through the EQ running into the plugin, we don't really need to do it so much within the plugin itself. Now from here on out, how you want to proceed really depends. You can run the plugin naked, but I would personally prefer to run it into a cabinet simulator or an amp simulator of some kind. In my particular case, I quite enjoy the Studio Devil Virtual Bass Amp Pro. As you can hear, it inherently gives it much more of a grunt, sort of an upper mid rolled off top end, very kind of rounded out fat sound. Obviously your mileage may vary depending on what you decide to use. You might just decide to use an impulse response of a cabinet of some kind, whatever your favorite sound is that you have lying around, but I find that this is a decent starting point. Now, if you're using this same plugin like I am, I will just point you towards the main settings that you want to play with at the start. Once again, most of them sound pretty good at noon, but the main one you want to look at is gain. You pick up some nice saturation and grunt with the gain around about noon in this case. The next one is treble. It's where we're picking up that gnarly upper mid-range sort of stuff, and we want a bit of that to cut through the mix. And the next one is the mid knob. Essentially just controlling how much fatness you want. Now from here on out, what you may want to do is kick in the graphic EQ as I have, because one of the drawbacks of this particular sound of this particular cabinet is that it has an extremely pronounced 2K range. It's one thing that I dip out on the graphic EQ, and I boost the top end a little bit going out. And from there on out, you've got the bright setting and the deep setting. Essentially controlling exactly what you'd expect them to control. All right, so enough of that. That's now our full range signal. So in a mixed context, you would rarely ever leave it here. What you essentially want to do is duplicate the bass track. So I've got the DI running on this, and I've got the DI running on the track above as well. Now one's obviously processed, the other one's clean. Alright, so what we want to do at this point is essentially divide up the frequency spectrum into two different bands. What we want is the distorted signal to handle just the upper and the mid frequencies. The way we do this is we kick in an EQ. I would highly recommend you use a linear phase filter. I generally use one at 18 dB per octave. I find it's a good middle ground for most purposes. So it sounds nice and wimpy that way. All of our lows are gone. So conversely, what we want to do is go to the DI track and do the opposite, where we essentially kick in a low pass filter around about the same range. Now these particular center points aren't fixed by any means. You can adjust to get more low end or less low end out of this, more low end, less low end out of the distorted signal. It all depends on what particular sound you're chasing. I generally find anywhere between 200 to 300 Hertz on the crossover frequencies is a good place to be. Alright, what we're essentially going to do is run both of these tracks into a bus together. That will allow us to hear them in unison. So here we go. So not too bad, but we generally don't want to leave things here. One of the very reasons that we split up the recording into different frequency bands is so that we can treat them individually. And one of the things that we want to do is compress the low end signal more than we compress the top end. Because if we're running high amounts of distortion or grit or whatever, that essentially acts like a compressor unto itself. You don't really want to stage much more on top of that. So in our particular case, when we clean up the bottom end, that allows us to compress it individually and actually control the performance. So in this particular case, let's just remove the filter and throw on our favorite bass compressor, which in my case would be a distressor or FG Stress or whatever distressor model you might have access to. Now, it doesn't have to be this particular compressor, but I can show you quite easily what settings it sounds best at to my ears. Obviously I've dialed this in before, and one of the main things that I find with this particular plugin is if you've got a well-performed bass track, as long as you're kissing the orange somewhere between 7 and 10, you're generally doing okay, but you can be hovering around about 5 or 6 up in the higher green. You can hear it sort of gaining grunt and consistency as it starts hitting that orange region. Gives it a nice bit of saturation, this plugin as well. So with the attack setting, I generally find anywhere between 5 and 4 is generally okay, because at this point you're still maintaining the transient attack. Opens it up fairly nicely there. So the transient attack is something we don't want to squish out too early, because if we have more of it down the line, that gives us more flexibility, because we can always bring it back down with a limiter or some such faster acting compressor. For the moment, we are essentially just chasing consistency and punch. So in that respect, what we do with the release is generally keep it around about 0 to 2, depending on how much consistency we want from the playing. The higher you go on this plugin, the slower the release. I like 1 in this particular case, and a ratio of 4 to 1 is always very safe with bass. Alright, so combining the signals again and listening to them. So it's starting to shape up, it's not too bad. What we want to be doing from here is essentially starting to move our processing to the global bus where the 2 tracks combine. So if we listen to it like this, the character of it is inherently good, but we've got a bit of junk in there that we need to clean out in order for it to be useful in a mixed context. What we'll essentially do is kick in another EQ, and we'll zero all of my prior processing, but we'll keep the center points to help explain things a little bit more easily. So the very first thing that I would do is actually drive a high pass filter up on this track. And one of the reasons I'll do that is so it doesn't conflict with the bass drum in the mix. Can you hear it eating the kick as soon as I take it off? And essentially what we want to do from here is move on to isolating the lower mid frequencies. So the lower mid frequencies are usually the main thing that gives you trouble with an organic bass recording. In this particular case, I've got a cut set up at about 255. I would generally sweep that around between 200 to 300 until I found the right spot. And then basically get rid of as much of that stuff as I can until I clear up the lower mid frequency band. Now in this particular case, you'll generally find that anything that's a bit non-linear and harsh up in the top end is going to start coming out. In this particular case, we have the upper mid frequencies coming from that cab simulator. So it's quite strong, as aforementioned, at about 2K, leading up to about 3 to 4K as well. So I've got these set up from before. Until it gets quite painful up and around there. It's usually a good sign that you can dip it out a bit. If you use an EQ like Pro Q, you can actually have it do this for you. Essentially isolating all the peaks that might be harsh in the spectrum and giving you essentially direct EQ control over them. It's an extremely flexible and handy tool, but because we've got them set up from before, we'll just use those. You essentially just set up the high-mid dips to work in balance with what you want from the mix. So generally speaking, you'd be doing this with the entire mix running and finding at what point it cuts through just enough for you, which we'll get to eventually. Alright, so from here on out, what I would say that you want to find is the flat mid-range, or what I would call the cardboard mid-range, and make sure that it's in check. In this particular case, we're doing pretty well because we've got a fairly scooped tone already. We can actually make things a little bit more 3D by cutting more of it. So generally speaking, I'd be sweeping this between about 600 to 800 hertz and finding the right spot. In my particular case, it's about 720. Maybe a touch lower. Alright, so from here on out, we find there's one more area that normally gives us trouble with organic bass recordings, and that's somewhere between about 160 and 170 hertz. You generally find you need to dip a little bit out of there in order to create clarity and decongest the mix. Find it just gives us a clearer, tighter bottom end, and we'd balance this out against the bass drum and the drums in general until it all sounds nice and open in context of the mix. And the final spot for us in this particular case is the bottom end again. So I'll generally set up a peak EQ band somewhere around about where the kick is likely to hit in the mix. In this particular case, about 73 hertz. And you'll generally find as you sweep it around that there's a bit of a sweet spot in between losing the power of the bass and allowing the bass drum to pop through. So if you play your cards right, you'll actually have less low-end energy to contend with, but it will actually sound bigger because you're allowing the kick to do its thing. The key to low-end processing in general is to use as little energy as you can for maximum illusion impact. Alright, so let's listen to that in context with the entire mix. Say we're looking pretty good right now. So from here on out, what you may want to do on that bus is give it an additional stage of compression. I find that this helps unify our low end portion and our mid to high portion together into the one cohesive signal, and it gives us that little bit of extra control. Now, in my particular case, I've got the CLA 76 plugin. In my particular case, I'd be aiming for about 1 to 2 dB reduction tops. Nothing absolutely crazy here. We're just looking for an additional stage of control. If you feel like you absolutely need it after that, because both of these plugins function on similar principles, except this one's a little bit more extreme, you can throw on an L1 just to catch the very worst of the peaks that have still come through, because this is an absolute brick wall limiter. It just won't let anything past its threshold. This just helps us keep the signal really pinned and really controlled in context of the mix. You can really downsize each individual mix element using tools like this, which can help in extremely busy arrangements. Alright, so we're looking pretty good. The only other thing I would recommend looking into from this point is to have possibly a secondary stage of saturation to sort of fill out the gaps in that tone. That's a fairly nice tone as far as a mix context goes, but what we might want to do is actually include a higher distortion signal to sort of fill in the gaps. And here's one that I've prepared earlier using a Darkglass Alpha Omega pedal. So by itself, it just sounds like this. The only additional processing I've done on top of the usual pedal and cabinet simulator is just the high pass filter to get rid of the lows, and I've done a low pass filter to actually get rid of the super highs, because on fully distorted signals you'll generally find that they're a little bit unbearable. Makes it a little bit rounder and smoother. And you can drive in as much or as little of this as you want. So as you can hear, it adds a little something, which we can hear in context of the whole mix. And finally on a different riff. This is the point where you would essentially run the entire mix and just tweak all of your settings, your global bus EQ, your distortions, whatever else, until it all vibes absolutely right. And that's about the crux of it. If you have any more questions about what's going on in this mix video, I would highly recommend checking out my book, The Systematic Mixing Guide. It essentially details all of the principles that we've gone over here in much more detail than the video, and essentially has a whole mix focus on how to actually get to this point in the first place. Now, you might have noticed that the bass guitar in this example sounded remarkably consistent and fairly powerful, worked fairly well with the plugin, and just generally made our lives really easy. That's actually because it's a sampled bass instrument, one that I'll be releasing onto the market over the coming weeks or months, hopefully, called SubMission bass. Keep an eye out for that, because I think it will pair extremely well with these tools. So thank you very much. If you enjoyed the content, please do comment and subscribe. If you want more content like this, there should be more on its way. So we'll see you next time.